The same year Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, Ford went to war against Chevy on the Trans Am circuit with this car. The Ford Mustang Boss. In the early 1960s, Ford was actually very good at Trans Am. From 1966 and 1977, they won the championship with the GT350 and the GT respectively. And then came Camaro. Just 1 year later, in 1968, Camaro introduced the Z28 package, which dominated Trans Am circuit racing. And by the way, if you don't know what Trans Am racing is, it's a racing series across the US for muscle cars only. You know, Transcontinental Am, America, Trans Am. Got it? Alright, good. And it humiliated Ford. Like, properly humiliated them. So, that year they began development on a new track weapon. And it would use the brand new 302 cubic inch V8, aka the Windsor V8. And it would have no compromises whatsoever. And would be one of the best handling cars America had ever made. And designer Larry Shinoda had the job at hand. Not only did he add a ton of performance improvements, but he also added Ford's first ever rev limiter to the car in 1968. Once they got, the handling down, the brakes down, the suspension on the engine, then they got to work on the exterior, because a racing car is all well and good, but if it looks ugly, who's gonna want to root for it? I mean, really. And they had some crazy ideas. The thing had actual working aerodynamics, including a front splitter and a rear wing. It had louvers on the rear because initially Shinoda wanted a completely solid rear window, basically deleting the rear window. But they wouldn't allow that to Ford execs, so he compromised with some slits on the rear called louvers. And that allows you to see out of the back while still looking like it's a one-piece, no-window setup from the top. And it even had freaking racing stripes on it for the road car. That just makes it 15 times faster. And speaking of speed, on the insurance forms, the car was officially listed as 290 horsepower, which is respectable. But we all know 60s American cars, they were a little bit tricky with their insurance figures to reduce the cost to let more people buy them. So we don't have an official figure for how much horsepower that car could have really made. What I do know is the Windsor V8 in racing form made 490 horsepower. And despite being a track weapon around the corners, it still did the quarter mile in 14.6 seconds. That's pretty good by today's standards. And, well, all that aerodynamics, all that braking, all that suspension tuning was an instant success. Sure, it lost money. Ford knew it was losing money, but they had to beat Chevrolet, and they did that. Motor Trend called it the basis in which all of Detroit must be judged. That's not bad. That's not bad at all. You know what was bad, though? The 1969 Trans Am season. It started out promising, though, with 4 wins in a row out of the first 5 races. But then came reliability. In the last 5 races of the season, Camaro swept all of them, securing the Manufacturers' Championship again. And all of Ford's work was wasted. So in 1970, they came back with better tires, a better pit strategy, extensive wind tunnel testing. And as a result, their driver, Parnelli Jones, freaking dominated. Parnelli won 6 out of the 11 races that season. And Ford got on the podium every single race except one, where they got 5th. You know, you enter 6 races, you get on the podium 10 times, you win 6. That's not bad. So not only did they win the Manufacturers' Championship for the first time in almost 4 years, they won the Drivers' Championship as well. Well done. Well done indeed. They had done it. The Rodeo race car was a proper race car. But that wasn't the only boss Ford made in 1969. No. You see, they were also competing in this thing called NASCAR. And they had a new NASCAR 429 cubic inch engine. And they thought, what if we put that in a Mustang? So they did, and they called it the Boss 429. Officially, once again, it produced 375 horsepower and a respectable 450 torque. But people did some dyno testing a few years ago and saw a truly staggering 600 horsepower in 1969 in a road car. That's freaking insane. And since they had loosey-goosey stats for their horsepower, they also had loosey-goosey stats for their engine and stats for the quarter mile, 14.1 seconds. 0 to 60, 7.1 seconds. Not bad at all. But those were probably a little slower than they could have been. Because the top speed of the car, when you take the rev limiter off, by the way, the rev limiter, when you take it off, lets the engine rev to 9,000 RPM. That car had a top speed of 175 miles an hour, which sounds terrifying in a Mustang from the 60s. Now, when you combine the 69 Boss 302 and the 1969 Boss 429, they made less than 4,000 of them. Meaning, the Boss 429 officially sold at auction for over $300,000. That's a lot of money. But it wasn't the rarest Boss they were made. No, they were initially planning to run the 302 for another year in 1971, but midway through production, they canceled it. So, they rebadged the 1971 Boss 302 as the 1971 Boss 351. Now, when I say rebadged, I mean literally rebadged, as in they scribbled out the 3, the 0, and the 2, and replaced it with 5-1. Literally, if you look at the back end of a Boss 351, you can see the 302 with 5-1 scribbled over it. They're like super rare. Now, that was the last we heard of the Boss name. There were hints throughout the 80s and 90s that the Boss would be back, and it was kind of back at the turn of the century in 2007 with the Saleen S302. And now a Saleen response, Saleen's tribute to Parnelli Jones, and they made 500 of them. And then the Boss name was dead again. Until 2010, when Ford officially announced a return to sports car racing and a return of the Boss name. And their target was a big one. The BMW M3. So they immediately began work on tuning the normal GT into another track monster. the Coyote V8 was upgraded to a 5-liter V8 called the Roadrunner. Because how do you beat a Coyote? You get a Roadrunner. Watch the cartoons, damn it. And the engine was made out of aluminum and had 444 horsepower and redlined at 7,500 RPM. Yeah. And then, since it's a racing car, they went racing with it. They ran it from 2010 to 2014, and it actually used production parts on the race car. This is weird, okay? The road car used racing parts, and the racing car used road parts. That doesn't make sense. And it didn't quite do as... And it ran in the Continental Tire Series, and it wasn't quite as successful. We'll leave it at that. It won a handful of races, but it can never really compete with the McLaren and the Aston Martins that it was running against. But that didn't stop the Boss from getting one last send-off. The Laguna Seca. Now, Laguna Seca is a raceway which the Boss 302 won at in 1970. It secured the championship there, actually. And it set the lap record for almost 5 years there in 1970. So, of course, that's what they named the hardcore racing version. This was as close to a road legal race car Mustang you could physically get. Rear seats, you don't need those. Let's put a crossbar in instead. You already have a wing on it? Let's make an actual proper wing. You want a splitter? We got you a nice big splitter. We got you brake discs that have functional coolers on it. We have hood vents that actually work and are not just for show. They had a bigger air intake. You have to remove the front fog lamps to let more air into the engine. It was a proper car. It even had adjustable suspension and massive Pirelli racing tires on it from the factory. As a result, it was faster than a Porsche 911 GT3 at Laguna Seca because it did a 139.2 around the track. That's still one of the fastest road legal cars ever around that racetrack. And this was made in 2012. And speaking of that, it was only around for 2 years, and it was only 1,000 made. And of the ones that we own, which is yellow, only 250 were made. And then the Boss was dead, once again, from the Ford lineup. 2013 was the last year of production, and it was never seen from again, and still not seen since. But that doesn't mean the Boss name still isn't around, or is a company that is making original Bosses, both 429s and 302s. But this time they have better brakes, more power, lighter weight. In fact, the 302 has 500 horsepower. I mean, it costs 175 grand, but it has 500 horsepower. And the Boss 429 has 815 horsepower. That's absurd. In a Mustang. The Boss name has always been a symbol of road legal racing cars, whether they be for the racetrack, around hot lapping circuits, or NASCAR dragsters. Whatever it is, the Boss 302 has always been and will forever be one of the fastest Mustangs ever around a circuit. We all know Ford is making a bunch of terrible, crappy, horrible SUVs now. Will the Boss ever be back? Who knows? These are desperate times, and maybe desperate times call for desperate measures.